Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this Radboud Reflects program on how democracies die fast and slow. This is a program that's organized in collaboration with the Sustainable Democracy Hotspot of the Institute for Management Research, also at Radboud University. Tonight's main speaker will be John Keane, who is a professor of politics at the University of Sydney and the Wissenschaftszentrum in Berlin. He studied politics, so John Keane studied politics, government, history, philosophy, and political economy at the universities of Adelaide, the University of Toronto, and he was a postdoctoral researcher at Cambridge. He is the founder of the world's first democracy research institute in the world, the Centre for the Research of Democracy in London, and he was the founder and the director of the Sydney Democracy Network. He is the author of 15 books, and his work is translated in 35 languages, no less. And he's one of the world's most renowned and influential thinkers on democracy. So it's a very great pleasure and privilege to have him here in Nijmegen. Professor John Keane will give a talk of approximately 40-ish minutes, and then we'll have half an hour discussion between Professor John Keane and Professor Carolien van Ham, who is a professor of empirical political political science at Radboud University. And she focuses on legitimacy and political representation, democratization and authoritarianism, electoral integrity and fraud, and the connection between democracy and human rights. She is a research associate of the Australian Human Rights Institute at the University of New South Wales, a senior research fellow at the Electoral Integrity Project at Sydney and Harvard University, and a research associate of the University of Gothenburg. She is recipient of the Discovery Early Career Research Award of the Australian Research Council. So we'll start with a talk by Professor John Keane, then we have 30 minutes of discussion between the two professors, and then we have 15 minutes of interaction with the audience, so that means that you can ask questions if you have them for as long as the time lasts, so that's 15 minutes. My name is Mark Sloys. I'm the Dean of Radboud Reflects, but my role is extremely limited today. It's just basically introducing people and sitting there. Professor John Keane, please.
Thank you very much, Mark. Dames en heren and an Borke. I wanted to say gute Abend and hartelijk bedankt to you all for coming, to Professor Carolien van Ham and all the members and participants in the Sustainability Democracy Network, a very exciting initiative here at Radboud, and also to Radboud Reflects. Thank you very much for your invitation. I bring you greetings from the continent near to Antarctica, and I'm very happy to be here in Nijmegen. My topic this evening is how democracies die, or how they are morphed into what I call phantom democracies. I want to look at the different tempos by which the substance and spirit of democracy undergoes a kind of democide, and what is left behind or lost when democide happens. Running through these remarks is the precept, the principle, that the renewal of the democratic imagination in these times and the renewal of democratic politics is badly needed. The writing, as you all know, is on democracy's wall. The great democratic revolution of modern times, as Tocqueville called it in the 19th century, seems again to be stalling, despite plenty of positive countertrends. More than, as you know, more than a few territorially bound state-organized democracies, Brazil, South Africa, the United States, are in a mess. you will know that there are plenty of observers who are likening our times to the 1920s and 1930s and the catastrophes suffered by parliamentary democracies in that period. And we see also the first signs among intellectuals of disaffection with democracy. That happened on a quite large scale in the 1920s and 1930s, especially in Europe. So, for example, we witness intellectuals like Yascha Mounk saying that liberalism and democracy are not happy partners, that liberalism is important to defend against the democratic principles that infect liberalism. And there are signs of a kind of melancholia among intellectuals. The example that I would give is David Runciman, who is professor of politics at Cambridge University, who in several recent books basically says that democracies are not good at handling crises, and goes on to say that actually an organic metaphor applies to democracy. Where are democracies going? It's a midlife crisis, he says. But the implication is that in the end, democracies will die. I'm not much impressed or persuaded by this melancholia. My concern here tonight with you is to renew the spirit of someone of whom you may not have heard, Karl Löwenstein, a German scholar who emigrated to America and who in the 1930s made the point that in times of emerging difficulties, in times of crisis, it's imperative for Democrats of all persuasions to pay attention to the enemies of democracy, to pay attention to the dynamics that lead to its downfall, paralysis, or its transformation into something else. My topic of how democracies die fast and slow, I beg you to understand, is not a fascination with death or morbidity. Here tonight, I am not kind of fascinated by the subject of death. On the contrary, what I think, to repeat, is that it's important in these times to understand how democracy as a way of life, as a way of handling power, actually is weakened, degenerates, and even suffers democide. The most popular interpretation, I'm going to speak about 5 interpretations of how democracies die. The most popular explanation is what I call catastrophism. According to the catastrophists, democracy dies in a great drama. Time speeds up. Things familiar suddenly fall apart. Under pressure, givens cease to be given. Great uncertainty grips how things are. Established ways of handling power crumble. History suddenly happens. This sudden death interpretation of how democracies destroy themselves or are destroyed, especially in war, you can find very interesting texts in the ancient Greek world. And the case in point that I have in mind is the so-called 30 Tyrants period. It was an 8-month period in Athens where there was effectively a coup d'etat by oligarchs who, in 8 bloody months, actually imposed a kind of cruel rule on the Athenian democracy. 30 oligarchs ruled. There were many murders, and there was the rounding up and execution of famous Democrats, to us famous, like Cleophon and Androcles. This catastrophist thinking about how living democracies suddenly decline and collapse, democide, are still very much in fashion. If you look at the way journalists have reported the January 6th events in the United States, you see that this a violent attack on the Capitol is portrayed as an attempt overnight, one morning, to to destroy, to overturn an election result, directed from the top by a defeated president and his buddies. This way of thinking about democracy, that it suddenly is destroyed in quick time, well, I have myself written a fat history of democracy, the life and death of democracy, in which there is recorded many instances of the way suddenly, very often at the hands of war, democracies are killed or commit democide. Evidence cited by Levitsky and Ziblatt, two recent authors, shows that during the past generation, around 3/4 of democracies that were in trouble met their end in this quick death way. This is, for instance, as well, the way that, say, in Thailand in 2014, a coup d'etat happened. It was, in fact, the 12th since the founding of modern Thailand in the 1930s. And this interpretation, this catastrophist interpretation, so is commonplace. I think one of its merits is to remind us of the fragility of democracy. It's very difficult to build a democracy as a way of handling power, as a way of life. It's very easy, it can happen very quickly that a democracy is destroyed, as the Germans would say, in ein Augenblick. But there is, I think, serious weaknesses to this rapid death catastrophist interpretation of democracy. One could say that democracies in difficulty are subject to what physicists call time dilation. What I mean by that is that democide can happen more or less quickly, more or less slowly. These different tempos by which democracies decline and disappear underscores the point that there is no single way in which democracies are destroyed or come by accident or designed to sabotage themselves. And there's a normative implication to catastrophism and to the multiple tempos by which democracy is ended. And it is that there is no single iron law of democide, let's call it. And therefore, friends of democracy, this is an argument, a basic argument tonight. Friends of democracy have to pay attention to the different rhythms, the different tempos by which democracies are destroyed or renewed. This brings me to a second interpretation. Let's call it gradualism. We learn from scholars such as the Spanish-American political scientist Juan Clintz and others that death by gradual cuts is much more common in the history of democracy, much more common than the catastrophists suppose. If you want to speak for a moment in Italian, we could say high-level dramas that unfold allegrissimo and furioso are only one of many rhythms of democide, because it turns out that the death of democracy can happen lentissimo, slowly, through protracted, steady accumulations of high-level political grievances, of power maneuvers, of knife-edged, cutthroat, behind-the-scenes actions. If you look, for instance, at the events this year in Burkina Faso, there have been 2 military coups d'etats. If you look at the way this polity, which set out to become a democracy, you see that it was it slowly imploded, it slowly destroyed itself with two military coups. In the space of a year, you see that these coups were a culmination of very complicated processes. And one could say much the same thing about historical cases, the way that, for example, parliamentary democracy was killed in Poland in the 1920s under the coup d'etat that was engineered by Pilsudski, who went on with the backing of the police and the army and big business and landowner groups to rule by decree until his, and using rigged elections until his death a decade later. The point is, with this second interpretation, that democide is a protracted process. It's painfully drawn out. It's often tortoise-paced. It's subject to flip-flops, breakthroughs, reversals, setbacks, changes of fortune. And according to this gradualist explanation, the death of democracy is overdetermined, as the philosophers say. That is, it's the outcome of multiple intersecting, convergent political developments. This gradualist explanation of how democracy is destroyed agrees with the catastrophists that democracy is defined narrowly. It means popular self-government based on periodic elections. And they also, the gradualists, agree with the catastrophists that democracy happens, the death of democracy happens at the level of governing institutions. It's a view I want to contest. But it's the maneuverings of political leaders, of parties, of military generals, of police, and so on, that is the site at which democracy is destroyed. They want to say, however, to paraphrase Marx, that democide happens because it's chosen by political actors in political circumstances, not of their choosing. So the general view is that the death of democracy happens usually gradually. The pace of self-destruction or destruction increases, so that the end result is that things in this gradual process typically come to the boil. A moment of denouement arrives. The forces of disorder and the enemies of democracy take heart. There are fierce, tough tussles. There are violent protests on the streets. There are bomb blasts that bring things to the boil. The government totters. The army moves from its barracks onto the streets to quell unrest and take control. The slow motion drama stops at this point. Democracy is finally buried in the grave it has slowly dug for itself. There's a third interpretation of how democide happens. What I want to say in this list is that actually we probably need each of these interpretations. No single one is comprehensive, universally applicable. The third has everything to do with populism and the demagogues who are typically part of populist politics. I've tried to show in a book called The New Despotism, that was published in 2020, that if you look at cases like Hungary or Kazakhstan or Turkey, you will see that ballots, votes, can be used to ruin democracy just as effectively as bullets. And this process by which democracies are destroyed by demagogues using elections, manipulating power arrangements, is a transformation that ends in not the death of democracy, but its strange transformation into a kind of a mutation, a kind of phantom democracy. So the transformation typically takes place in fits and starts. At first, it's gradual, in slow motion, then it gathers pace. We could say lentissimo gives way to prestissimo. So this problem of populism and demagoguery was first, I think, recognized in the ancient Greek democracies, where the problem of the demagogue A demagogue as a misleader of the people, as someone who accumulates power and destroys the power sharing of a democracy. This was first analyzed and well analyzed by Greek writers. And here, in my work, I've tried to say that from the beginning, populism and demagogues are actually an autoimmune disease of democracy. Democracy gives birth to movements and parties, groups, factions led by demagogues who take advantage of democratic freedom, say, of public assembly, but in the end accumulate followers to the point where they begin to act arbitrarily and they destroy the spirit and substance of democracy. You can see this, it's well documented in the case of Athens, as I say, and it's also striking that the Athenian democracy and other democracies of that period developed techniques for dealing with demagogues. One of my favorites is ostrakismos. This is ostracism, where a vote in Athens for a period was taken every year to decide which citizen was the most dangerous for the democracy, which demagogue, was capable of destroying it. And a vote was taken and the chosen candidate was sent into exile. It's a very good idea. You can imagine getting rid of Bolsonaro or Trump or DeSantis and others by sending them, I don't know where, Antarctica or somewhere like that. Not Australia, I have to say. They are not welcome. What I've tried to show in my work is that the age of electoral democracy that came after assembly democracy, from the end of the 18th century, the idea that democracy is self-government of the people, but through their elected representatives also produces, in this autoimmune disease way, the problem of demagoguery. I've looked, for example, at the case of Argentina, where in the 1820s there are characters like Juan Manuel de Rosas, and all the way through to, say, Huey Long in the 1930s in the United States. Why does populism, as I'm trying to summarize it, why does it threaten democracy? Well, what happens is that through elections, parties arise and there are leaders who speak all the time about the people. And they use this language of the people to seduce followers, to attract followers who are annoyed with and disgruntled with the existing system. The populist party, led by a demagogue in the making, wins an election. There's much joy in the streets. The demagogue celebrates the victory of the people. The demagogue plays the role of a great redeemer, as a Mexican scholar and writer, André Krause, says. And when this process carries on in the second round of elections, there is an attempt by populist governments in the early modern period and today to destroy the independence of the judiciary. Erdogan calls it the juristocracy. They're not elected. The people have had no say in their appointment, etc. There are attacks on the public or civil service. There are attacks on the parliament. There are attacks on journalists. Modi in India refers to journalists as prostitutes. There's a lot of ruling by cheating, as a Hungarian sociologist, András Szajó, says. What is born, in other words, in this process is a kind of elective despotism. It's Thomas Jefferson's view. The pace of change begins to quicken. There is much talk of democracy and the people. There is a building of a kind of spoils system, a kind of patronage system to reward supporters of the government and its talk of the people. Pork barrel politics, as the Americans call it, thrives, so that for instance, earlier this year in the Hungarian elections, it's estimated that Viktor Orbán spent 3% of the Hungarian GDP on winning that election by offering higher handouts to members of the army and police, tax refunds to 2 million employees, and an extra month's benefits to pensioners. Every other populist trick in the book is played. Threats and bribes in backroom meetings, dinner deals with business oligarchs, court victories, state-of-the-art media, dog whistling, and message bombing, calculated silence, and brute force. The consequence is, in this third explanation, that elections become more than elections. They're turned into elections without democracy. They are kind of carnivals of political seduction, celebrations of the mighty power of the state endorsed by the votes of millions of people. But as the transition away from power-sharing democracy gathers pace, something more startling happens, which I think deserves much deeper research and reflection. Because what happens is that, to put things very simply, populist governments, when they've had at least 2 terms and with the prospects of more, begin to redefine who the people are. One of the paradoxes of the new populism of our times is that a new kind of demogenesis happens, that all the talk of the people implies that there are certain people who don't belong to the people. So Trump repeatedly spoke, and still today speaks, about the real people. There are non-people by implication. Or Kaczynski in Poland refers to Poles of a worse sort. They don't belong to the Polish people. Or Orbán speaks about his followers as real Hungarians. That implies that there are others living on the territory who are not real Hungarians. And so what begins to happen, unless it's stopped, is that a kind of purification of the people begins to happen. It's a great paradox, and it's as if Alice in Wonderland scenario unfolds. Because what happens with manipulation and money and ruling by cheating is that the government votes in the people. And once that happens, the process of democide is nearly complete. The consequence is that power-sharing constitutional democracy is replaced by something like a phantom democracy. The regimes that are appearing under our noses, for example, in Serbia, or for example, in this region, in Hungary, that are a similar process is going on in Turkey. It could well come to pass in the United States. What is interesting is that the despotisms that are produced by this dynamic are not old-fashioned military dictatorships. They're not autocracies. I think it's not a good word. They're not fascist regimes or totalitarianism. They are something else, what Hungarians call a mafia state, in which a demagogue and his supporters, his power group, begins to get their hands on governmental institutions, win elections, win the followership of millions of people, and in the end, the substance and spirit of democracy is destroyed. Fourth explanation refers to civil society. So if you look at the literature on how democracies die, you see not only that there are interpretations about the sudden death or the slower death of democracy, but you also see that, that these explanations, interpretations that I've just talked about, typically concentrate on governing institutions. But there is another way in which democracies are destroyed, where the spirit and substance of equality and power sharing and respect for others, dignity, respect for difference is destroyed. And it is when the social foundations of democracy are destroyed. The point here is that there are many scholars who, in this last few years, when reflecting on democide, rather underestimate this point. I think Stephen Levitsky and Danny Ziblatt's How Democracies Die, published in 2018, is an example. It's only towards the end of this book that they get around to talking about the anger and the frustration, the annoyance, the disgruntlement of millions of Americans because these Americans feel that their life chances are shrinking, that their children will not live as well as them, and so on. What I want to say is that this fourth interpretation is a very important interpretation. It reminds us that democracy is a whole way of life. This view of democracy as a kind of society was a fundamental principle of my teacher, C.B. Brough Macpherson, under whom I did my doctorate. For Macpherson and for others, it's a much older thought in the history of democracy. Democracy is a whole way of life. It's committed to the principle that the people consider each other as equals, and a democracy is a polity in which power is shared and in which people try to make the best of themselves. This view of democracy as a whole way of life has, of course, serious normative implications. It implies that a democracy is a special way of life in which people from different walks of life rub shoulders, they see eye to eye, they cooperate and they compromise, they generally think of themselves as each other's equals. And it follows from this that democracy is much more than attending local public meetings or lectures on how democracies die. It is, in fact, a form of life that implies that democracy requires freedom from violence, freedom from hunger, freedom from personal humiliation. Democracy is saying no to misogyny. It's saying no to the maltreatment of children. It's saying no to the brazen arrogance of callous employers who maltreat workers as mere commodities. Democracy, we could say from this perspective, is humility. It's the willingness to admit the impermanence of life, that we are all vulnerable here on earth, that in the end nobody is invincible, that ordinary lives are never ordinary. Democracy is free access to information. It's also a learned sense of worldly wonder. It's the everyday ability to handle unexpected situations, to make judgments wisely. Democracy is the friend of contingency. It's the refusal of the dogma that things can't be changed because they're naturally fixed in stone. Democracy thus implies the need for periodic insurrection, the refusal to put up with everyday forms of bullying, of snobbery, of toad-eating, of idolatry, of lies and bullshit. But now the question, what happens when the social foundations, the civil society base of any existing democracy is allowed to disintegrate? As, for example, in India, as, for example, in the United States. What happens to power sharing, what I call monetary democracy, when governments, businesses, citizens allow its social footings to be damaged or destroyed? Well, I've tried with an Indian colleague in a book called To Kill a Democracy, looking at the Indian case. I've tried to show with my co-author how it is that the degradation of civil society actually impacts on democratic politics, including the very upper echelons of government. It's a long and complicated story, but it is a slow motion road to democide. You know, the degradation of civil societies, allowing a precariat to form, allowing misogyny to flourish, allowing the disaffection of young people, etc. The slow motion process actually, in the end, it takes probably several decades to begin impacting on the upper level structures of government and processes of elections. How does it affect democracy when a civil society is degraded? First of all, most obviously, many democracies have very ideal constitutions that specify all kinds of rights, liberties, and equalities. But when a civil society is allowed to degenerate because there is no welfare state, then citizens come to be gripped by the sense that the Constitution is all very well, but daily life is very different. And this can encourage the growth of a kind of cynicism towards the judiciary that itself becomes vulnerable to attacks like that of Erdogan, who, as I say, attacks juristocracy. Massive imbalances of wealth, widespread violence, famine, unevenly distributed life chances have other effects. They call into question, they degrade the ethical principle that in a democracy, people are equals, that they are citizen partners of one another. When there is inadequate diet, when there is rotten healthcare, when there is opioid and other forms of drug addiction, citizens lose their lives. This is a violation of the ethics of democracy. People's dignity is destroyed. And when people's dignity is destroyed, the powerless are actually slowly robbed of self-esteem. Of course, it's always possible under these conditions that millions of mutinies, as Indians say, can happen. People can refuse this degradation of civil society. But the degradation of civil society slowly through time, if it's not contested, actually begins to encourage rulers to rule arbitrarily. And it also produces a kind of resignation among millions of people, cynical disaffection with the way that government operates. It can also, as the evidence is beginning to mount after 40 years of neoliberalism, the evidence is that it's in this soil of a degraded civil society where millions of people feel what the French call ressentiment. They feel annoyance, they are angry, and they're envious of the wealthy and powerful. It's in this soil that the demagogue comes into season. If you want to look at an example, just consider for a moment the dynamics in contemporary Tunisia. It's touted as one of the few successful transitions to democracy, which is now in a serious crisis under the president Kais Saied. One of the main points made by this emerging regime is that previous governments in the transition neglected matters such as unemployment and the indignity of women, etc., etc. This thus means that when civil society is degraded, messiahs, redeemers, begin to appear. And this, in the end, unless contested, means that civil society begins to be weakened. It can even be crushed outright. The consequence is there is a kind of phantom democracy that becomes the new reality. Finally, fifth interpretation is the slowest form of democide, a kind of political sleepwalking, I think we could call it, which should be the most worrying for democracies. I'm referring here to the fact, underemphasized in the literature, of growing public significance, is that every actually existing democracy is embedded in ecosystems. and the destruction of those ecosystems have feedback loop effects on democracy. Democracies can destroy themselves not only by inflicting indignities on citizens, such as domestic violence or poor health care or religious and racial bigotry, or gun crimes or daily shortages of food and housing. Democracies play dice with their disappearance. They risk democide when citizens and their representatives succumb to a kind of human thoughtlessness and inaction. A kind of thoughtlessness and inaction that impacts on the spirit and substance of democracy, that happens when democracies blindly ignore the anti-democratic effects of unusual weather events, of species extinctions, of pestilences and other environmental emergencies. And when democracies fail to recognize that democracy, as has been conceived until now, is probably the most anthropocentric political ideal ever known to humanity. What could be more arrogant? What could be more anthropocentric than the presumption that democracy is self-government of a people who can decide how they live on Earth, including extraction of resources and destruction of the biomes in which they dwell. Making sense of the anti-democratic effects of what Amitav Ghosh, the Indian writer, calls a great derangement. Making sense of this, I think, initially requires frank encounters with the many worrying symptoms of which you're no doubt aware. These symptoms, these environmental pushbacks that are affecting our lives, are as if Earth takes revenge against actually existing democracies and their human destroyers. In Australia, in my home town of Sydney, you will have read about the huge wildfires that burned uncontrollably, spitting nighttime skies with blood orange light and smoke. You will know about heat waves that are so extreme that roads and railway tracks buckle and melt. You'll know about severe droughts, atmospheric river-driven megastorms that cause extensive flooding, polluted and diseased water, landslides, and so on. It's in this context that some of these environmental catastrophes that appear to be growing in number, some of them are actually very slow motion. They don't tend to get as much media coverage. For instance, melting ice shields and glaciers, or a looming silent spring. This is the phrase used by the American woman writer in the early 1960s, Rachel Carson, or insect apocalypse. All of these induced by pesticides and invasive species and so on. All of these are slow motion processes that affect democracies in the end, as I will explain in just 1 minute. Examples: 1/5 of Spain now suffers desertification. 60% of insects, according to a recent report, have actually died in the United Kingdom during the past 2 decades. I mean, these silent, invisible, very slow motion dynamics are actually having already observable negative effects on democracies. For a start, democracy has been greened in the past generation. There has been the growth of a remarkable number of green innovations, citizen science projects, coral reef monitoring networks, green think tanks, bioregional assemblies, green parties, of course, global bio-agreements, such as the Ergos Convention, Zadist, as they are called in France, Zadist-style occupations of land to prevent, say, the building of a new airport. Written constitutions that recognize the duty of citizens to respect and to pay attention to their environments. The extension of legal rights to whole areas of our planet, such as in New Zealand. These are all examples of innovations that fundamentally enliven and change the meaning of democracy. But the point is here that when environmental catastrophes begin to accumulate, both fast and slow, democracy, the mechanisms, the spirit, is slowly destroyed. Bruno Latour has pointed out that democracy can be understood as, it can be likened to a kind of fragility of coral reefs. It follows from this way of thinking that that these environmental catastrophes actually destroy the raison d'etre, the substance of many of these institutions. But other things happen. Citizens suffer injury and death. The latest estimates is that roughly 115 people die each day from some kind of weather-related disasters. This is another dynamic of which no doubt you are aware, which is that these environmental disasters that grow in number are actually occasions that where people's lives are disorientated, degraded, and we know from writers like José Saramago or Camus that it is in catastrophes, it is in these moments of disruption that actually civil society can be destroyed. People become tend to become nasty to one another. It's a much worse world than described by Thomas Hobbes in The Leviathan, where there is a war of each against all. It's an imaginary picture of what happens when you have no government or law. What's worse is that under these conditions, Pakistan, under massive floods, is that people's lives are no longer secure, that there's a certain nastiness towards other people despite the solidarity, but not even the biomes in which they dwell can be taken for granted. And there's one other thing that needs to be pointed out, that it's under these environmental shocks, extreme weather events, for instance, that typically what happens is the imposition of emergency rule. An emergency rule is the antithesis of democracy. Emergency rule gets people used to conforming to diktats under extreme conditions. This is obviously bad for democracy. And there is just one other thing to say about how democracies are weakened and destroyed when they undermine and tamper with and destroy the habitats in which citizens dwell. And it is that the ethos of democracy is challenged and can be weakened irreversibly. I'm thinking here of, I mentioned her already, Rachel Carson, for whom the capacity to wonder, to be puzzled by the world, to note the beauty and complexity of the world, is a very basic democratic instinct. It follows from this, the more species are destroyed, the capacity for wonder is challenged. Or there are contexts in which an Australian thinker, Glenn Albrecht, has coined this term, solastalgia. What does this mean? Well, solastalgia is the feeling of a kind of homesickness, a kind of sense of loss, a melancholy, when the territory in which you grew up or the territory in which you live is damaged by a bushfire or a great flood or some other environmental catastrophe. This sense of solastalgia is a direct blow against the ethos of democracy. I think that I'm going to get the guillotine very soon, so I will try to draw this to an end, dames en heren. I want to say something in conclusion about self-restraint. Self-restraint, the great distinguished sociologist Norbert Elias, who spent his last years in the Netherlands, once observed that democracy is a very special form of life, a way of handling power, because it requires a very large degree of self-restraint in matters of handling power and violence. According to Elias, democracy is a higher level of civilization. It is a way of handling power that requires democracies to prevent unlimited power. Democracy is self-restrained use of power. I think in terms of the sketch I've offered of how democracies die, fast and slow, concluding with this environmental interpretation, I think a whole new meaning is given to this Elias way of thinking. Democide can happen in multiple ways. Democide can be fast or slow. But what is common to all of the mechanisms that destroy democracy is that power ceases to be self-restrained, that arbitrary power flourishes. This has, of course, serious implications for how we think about democracy's enemies. My survey tonight, I hope you will see, implies that democracy's enemies include not only army generals, backstabbing political operators, populist demagogues, or wealthy, power-loving oligarchs who don't care about the fate of civil society. It turns out that the most dangerous enemies of democracy are individuals, groups, institutions that are simply unconcerned about the destruction of our biosphere. Hence the importance, I think, of your initiative in the field of sustainability and democracy. There's another implication, I think, of this survey of how democracies die, fast and slow, and it is that narrowly institutionalist, government-centered, I think this is really the guillotine. It's one way of getting me off stage. I will finish in 1 minute. The implication here is that democracies can be killed, they can die, not only at the institutional governmental level. Social deprivation and environmental ignorance and self-destruction equally can destroy democracy. The point is that democracy is much more than pressing a button or marking a box on a ballot paper. It goes beyond the mathematical certitude of election results and majority rule. It's not reducible to lawful rule through independent courts or attending local public meetings or watching breaking news stories scrolled across a screen. Guided by the spirit of equality and refusals of predatory power, democracy is a whole way of life whose delicate geosocial foundations are ignored or neglected at its peril. Democracy dies a slow-motion death, democide in the very slow rhythm of adagissimo, not only when citizens suffer indignities such as domestic violence and bigotries of various kinds, shortages of food, and so on. Democracies also destroy themselves when citizens and their representatives forget that extreme weather events, pestilences, COVID-19 and other environmental emergencies breed power grabs, that democracy won't have a future unless its ideals and practices are democratized by extending the democratic principle of self-restraint and humility to our relations with what is still called, falsely, nature. So, hartelijk bedankt. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay. Now he's in the middle.
Ah, yeah, okay.
Yes, absolutely. Oops. Okay, thank you very much for this not very uplifting, but extremely interesting talk. Carolien, would you care to respond to what you just heard?
Yes, I'd love to. Thank you, John. I had a lot of questions, and now I listen to you, and now I have a lot more questions, different questions.
Sure.
So I'm going to start with the different questions that came to mind. So if democracy is an anthropocentric system, as you propose, and we find ourselves in this current situation of basically destroying ourselves, ultimately.
Yeah.
Could you conceive of a new form of democracy that would not be as anthropocentric? Can there be a shift in power even there? To
Yes.
include, what would it look like? Penguins voting?
Well, I think one immediate problem, if you think of democracy as essentially about elections, the problem is that rocks and rivers and animals and butterflies and insects can't vote. They can't speak for themselves. But I think that what has been going on, this is the positive side. I mean, tonight's lecture was a warning. It's a sort of precautionary tale of what to watch out for, to keep alive, what's required to keep alive the spirit and the substance of democracy. So one of the things, the counter-trends that has been going on for at least since the 1950s, and it's global, is the slow but sure inclusion of the biosphere in human affairs, in democratic politics. Green parties are only one such instance. You have how many green parties in the Netherlands? At least one, and you have an animal rights party and so on. But it's also the growth of these monitoring watchdog bodies whose specialty is to, so to say, give a voice, to represent the biomes in which we dwell into democratic politics. And I think that I never saw anything like it in my life. It is entirely new in the history of democracy. And it is, if you like, the stretching of the meaning of representation. So representation is not just the selection of a candidate who represents you for a relatively short time. And if you don't like that representative, you blow the whistle on them, you throw them out in the streets. There are other forms of representation that I think are part of what I'm calling monitory democracies, in which rivers and lakes and oceans and fish and the quality of air, etc., are brought into, they are represented as part of us, that we are entangled with these, and that thinking. So
should we go to a Latour sort of model of parliament? So we have representatives for humans, and we have representatives for soil and for air, and
Bruno Latour, who sadly passed away a few weeks ago, is, I think, one of the great contemporary green thinkers, and who spent his life making the case for returning to earth. What I tried to say tonight is that democracies need to pay attention to the slowest form of democide, and the slowest form of democide is when democracies act as if they're not on earth. It's very, it should be very simple. I think among young people, the perception of this is growing, the sense of the fragility of our biomes. So the greening of our democracy that's going on is, I think, a slow transformation of its meaning. So it is no longer the principle that people as equals are entitled on earth to govern themselves. It's the morphing of that into the principle that democracy is people living on Earth who treat each other as equals, who slowly come to the conclusion that we have to treat so-called nature differently, and we have to start thinking of it as somehow the equal of ourselves, and that it's even capable of taking revenge on us. I mean, this is a long and complicated story, but you can see that, as Latour says, there are moments when, as he called it, Gaia gets annoyed with us. And extreme weather events is one case in point. So are pestilences. This COVID-19 is a deep environmental. It has deeply environmental roots. If you follow the work of Peter Piot, who I think is one of the great virologists of our time, he points out that, these pestilences, this is not the last one, and it's certainly not the first. And likely there are more, because somewhere on the planet, ecosystems are interrupted, destroyed, and zoonotic viruses jump from animal to animal because there's a kind of scrambling of ecosystems, and they can jump to humans. And then there is a global pestilence. So I think, in short, if there is hope for democracy, it is this transformation, this redefinition of democracy, which is entirely new in its history. If you look at past democrats, going back to the Greeks, they suppose that nature is out there, separate from us, and very often, you look at a character like Mazzini in the 19th century, a great Italian democrat. He supposes that, nature is a resource for democracies to use as they wish. This is a way to kill democracy, I think.
Can I
You may.
strike a lighter note? So this refers to one of the modes in which democracy dies, as you pointed out, is this growing frustration among citizens that the promises of democracy are not being met.
Yeah.
Right? Because democracy has this promise of equality, and we're never in a situation of actual equality. So there's a constant call for protest. There's a constant call for insurrection, as you call it, this periodic insurrection, right? So the people who are dissatisfied with how democracy is working in practice are then holding it to its ideals and then starting to claim this democracy needs to work better, it needs to improve on itself. So what Markov calls democracy as a moving target. So in your interpretation, this frustration seems to lead to democide, sort of necessarily, whereas I would argue actually it's an opportunity to improve, and that's one of the things we mean by sustainable democracy. Frustration is a catalyst for change. We need that frustration to improve current democracies, to actually make them better. So it could also be a way out of democide, if that makes sense.
It certainly does. I think instead of interpreting tonight's talk as the talk of a misery guts, as the English say, everything is going badly, and look at all of these ways in which democracy dies. This was a precautionary lecture in which there are at least 5 ways you can prevent democracy from being destroyed or weakened. Don't allow military coup d'etats. Keep your army in the barracks. Don't allow, high-level political maneuverings that are behind closed doors. Don't allow demagogues to get their way in the world. Do not allow your civil society in any context to be degraded, and don't allow biodestruction. So the dissatisfaction that comes, that democracies produce, you are right, can be treated, it can be dealt with in multiple ways. That was one of the implications of tonight's lecture. And yes, politics decides whether the disaffection, the grumbling, the belly aching, can be harnessed to prevent the destruction of species, or to prevent a coup d'etat, or to prevent the degradation of a civil society, or stop populists in their tracks. Yes, but that doesn't happen automatically.
Can you say a little bit more about that harnessing? How does that work in your view? How is the dissatisfaction harnessed to actually strengthen democracy?
Well, so democracy has grand ideals, and those ideals are never met. And so in the history of democracy, the fact that those ideals were there were a catalyst to demand greater freedoms, to demand greater rights. The suffragettes said, if we're equal, women are equal too. Then the civil rights movement said, well, if we're equal, black people are equal too. So it's a catalyst for continuous improvement. It's a catalyst, for me at least. The promises of democracy are sort of out there, and they are a beacon to go and improve, right? So I read protests, for example, farmer protests, as we have them in the Netherlands now, as people who are currently not being served the promises that democracy has, and pointing out, hey, look, this is not working for us. Yeah. We need to do better. Yeah. And so for me, at least, elites should pick up on that and then actually recognize it for what it is, right? So not go, well, we need to defend democracy because representative democracy is awesome and it's amazing. No, there's people on the street protesting, so there's something wrong. Like, you need to go and fix that, right? It's, so use those indications of frustration as a signal that you need to improve, that you need to do better.
I may say one of the least obvious but most important features of democracy is a special form of handling power, is that when it takes root, it encourages people to denature power, to think of power relations in any context as contingent, as transformable. That the way things are now are not necessary.
As chosen.
That the degradation of women by men is not cool. It's not given by God. It's not in the nature of, the bodies of men and women. This originally is an idea of Tocqueville, and it remains hugely important. And for this reason, in the most recent book, I speak about democracy and its punk quality. There are moments when citizens say no, they cause trouble, they're unhappy, and this can initiate a series of changes that actually have long-term effects.
Can I ask a question? So how do you distinguish between the kind of dissatisfaction that is purely sort of focused on one's own, or the interest of one's own group, and the kind of dissatisfaction that is aimed at, being angry about inequality, for instance? Or in other words, your example of the farmers is really interesting. How do you balance that kind of anger with a sense of the kind of equality that John talks about is the basis of democracy? So that's where I see some sort of tension.
I don't, actually, because for me there is only self-interest. And if you truly respect the other human being as an equal human being, their interest is as important as your interest. And so you have to listen, and you have to come to a compromise.
Okay, so well understood self-interest actually means being sensitive to the equality of everyone around you.
Yeah, if you fully recognize the equality of other people, that's the way to find the public interest, because then you can speak to each other as equals.
Understood.
Yeah. For me, at least. I don't know how you do it in practice, but then I'm a scientist, so...
It's also worth adding, I think that's absolutely right. It's worth adding that democracy, unlike, monarchy or the Soviet vision or the Leninist vision of socialism, you never get there.
Yeah.
It's one of its magical features, one of its beautiful qualities is that you never get there. It's a process, always unfinished. It has Claude Lefort, the French thinker, used to describe democracy as having a sauvage quality. It doesn't mean savage. It means a disruptive quality, and that those disruptions are part of the, if you like, the normality of democracy. We're living through one of these periods where there's spreading confusion about where it's all going, who we are, who's the winner, who's the loser, what can we do about this and that. And it's as much an opportunity as ending in a complete catastrophe.
Can I ask you a question? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, go for it. I was just going to say if we have time for one more question. But
Yeah?
Yeah, we do.
Sure. Yeah,
okay.
go ahead.
No,
Go
you
ahead.
can go as well.
We have time for 2 questions then.
Okay, awesome. But, well, John, you're one of the foremost historians of democracy. You've mapped the life and death of democracy over many thousands of years in your works. And so I was wondering, the current period, we're presenting the current period as, oh my God, a moment since the millennium, since the turn of the millennium, a moment of breakdown. All of a sudden we see democracies backsliding that we thought were stable, that we thought were immune to backsliding, right? Mm-hmm. The United States, Poland, Hungary. But if we take a larger look at the history of democracy, it's only in the early 1990s that democracies start becoming the most common political system worldwide, right? Before that, authoritarian regimes were always in the majority. Mm. So could it be that actually the strange moment in history is that odd moment from the mid-1990s to the turn of the millennium, where we have this brief moment in which democracies happen to be the majority in the world, and that we're actually now returning to normality, where authoritarian regimes, or as you call them, despotic regimes, are in the majority. So is this really, is this an exceptional moment of decline? Or are we actually we had an exceptional moment and we're returning to the normal state of history?
I wish I had a crystal ball. I mean, we'll see what the historians say in 50 years from now. And that's not a flippant reply to a really important question. But this is, to repeat, a period in which there is an alternative to democracy, power-sharing constitutional democracy with active civil societies, just the opposite of everything I spoke about tonight. There is an alternative, and I do call these regimes despotisms. Saudi Arabia, Russia. I mean, the list grows. And these are regimes, interestingly, in which there is lots of talk of the people, in which rulers at all levels very often say our democracy is preferable to that, neurotic, unstable, quarrelsome, degraded liberal democracy called the United States. Of course, it's puppetry. Of course, it's maquillage. It's camouflage. But these are regimes that are threatening of democracy, particularly in these times, in which these regimes are smart. We're going to see how smart Putin's Russia is, but they're smart. They learn the arts of ruling, and they hold elections. But they are top-down systems of power with great concentrations of wealth at the top. They're pseudo-democracies, but they're a serious alternative and to power-sharing monetary democracies. And of course, it has to be honestly said that the West, that actually existing democracies very often feed these despotisms. French arms sales to Saudi Arabia, for example. This is the dark side of actually existing democracies. Well, these are, to repeat, not replays of the 1920s and 30s, I don't think. I don't think these are totalitarian regimes. They all have a middle class. The middle class feels loyal to the system. They have elections, and they're rigged, of course, etc., etc. I don't think they're systems of fear and terror and mass mobilization and grand ideologies. They're more complicated than that. They're more sophisticated, and they're more dangerous. And they're going to be with us for a while. We better get to know them. And in that way, the spirit and substance of democracy can better be defended.